Hey there, welcome to another installment of Strange Planet. Well, it began over a century ago in the swamps and small towns of southern Louisiana. Entire families, black families, slaughtered in their beds. No witnesses, no motive, no mercy. Only the echo of the train whistle in the night and the dull, wet sound of an axe. The killer or killers left behind no fingerprints, no footprints, only a message scrawled in pencil on a bloodstained door. When he maketh inquisition for blood, he forgetteth not the cry of the humble. And below it, two words that still chill the blood. Human Five. What was the Human Five? A Bible verse gone mad? A death cult? A secret religious sect that believed murder could bring salvation? Or was this the work of one itinerant preacher traveling the rails, leaving carnage and scripture in his wake? My guest tonight has spent years retracing those tracks. He's a Louisiana native, a journalist, and a researcher who unearthed this century-old nightmare buried beneath the mud and memory of the Deep South. Todd C. Elliott is the author of 5 books, including 2 nonfiction investigations into some of America's darkest mysteries. His first, Arose by Many Other Names, Rose Tarami and the JFK Assassination, explored Louisiana's shadowy connections to the Kennedy killing. But it was his follow-up, Axes of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders that took him home to Lake Charles, where one of these ghastly crimes occurred. Todd believes the Axeman killings may represent the largest unsolved serial murder case in U.S. history. His most recent work, Infectus, Bedtime Stories of Horror, shows that his fascination with the macabre hasn't faded, it's only evolved. Today we'll step back into that feverish Louisiana winter of 1912, where faith, fear, and fanaticism converged, and the line between religion and ritual was erased by the swing of an axe. Todd C. Elliott joins me to discuss Axes of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders. Todd, welcome to Strange Planet. How are you?
Thank you, Richard. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Your book suggests a century ago a death cult may have roamed the American South, murdering entire families with an axe, leaving biblical messages on the walls, and then vanishing into the night. Are we talking about a single madman or something far more organized, even ritualistic?
At first, everybody in these communities that were affected by the murders were terrified of a singular entity that they never saw, they never witnessed, but it was referred to as the Axeman. What is interesting is one of the first people ever arrested for these crimes was a woman. So we start to get into the story of Clementine Barnabette, who quite possibly could have been, an early female serial killer. But what was strange about following her arrest, the murders continued, the killings kept going on, and it was just something that seemed to exonerate Clementine Barnabette. But what is interesting is she was arrested with 2 other preachers. So there's religious undertones to this whole thing, and it's 1912 Louisiana. It was a little backwards back then, but without a doubt, the communities were terrified, and everybody from just about New Orleans to Texas were terrified of the Axeman's horror.
So take us back there. First of all, let's get some numbers here. Obviously, we're not talking about numbers. These were individuals. These were entire families.
Right.
But tell me about the carnage. How many victims?
Well, it's a high number. I mean, there were definitely over 50. When you're slaughtering families of 5 at a time in one night, that was also something that made me consider the possibility that there was no way this was one person, that this was, something in concert with the Human Five, which was just, a clue left behind, and really from a biblical verse didn't make a lot of sense. But if you suggest that there was a cult, the Axeman murderers might have been out there doing this, known as the Human Five, it makes a little more sense. And then I delve further into the story, and how does a sleeping family of 5, a mother, a father, and 3 children, and in some cases 6, how do they not awaken from their slumber in the middle of the night. I go into theories that they might have also been drugged. You have elements of these roaming and traveling preachers with connections to a New Orleans church that has ties to voodoo. And there's a bit of voodoo mania going on at the time. And when you said that they were black families, one of the interesting factors is they weren't exactly black. They were mixed race families. Today we would just consider them African Americans regardless, but back then there was, I'm not sure if there was discrimination, if they viewed mixed race families as an abomination. Someone felt so strongly about this. And the way I found out about these murders, I read a book that came out in 1993, and it was called Raising Hell, and it's an encyclopedia of devil worship and satanic crimes by Michael Newton. And that book starts like an encyclopedia with the letter A, and they had A for axe. And I was just fresh out of high school when I learned about these murders, and the thing that shocked me was that one of them happened in my hometown.
Right.
So I never really put it away. Back then you had to go to the library and do all sorts of research in the local university. And that's what I did just because I wanted to solve the mystery. And I still think it's unsolved. I think it is America's largest unsolved serial killing. And you have to understand it at this time, this was the biggest news across the country. Headlines were coming out of places like my hometown in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and they were being read all over the country. In fact, it was the biggest news story until the Titanic sank in 1912.
Wow. Isn't that interesting? You were out of high school. It happened,
Mhm.
one of them anyway, happened in your hometown, and yet
Yeah.
you didn't know about it. Many people probably,
Yeah.
I'd never heard of it. Why do you suppose that is? I mean, this is a serial killer on the rampage in America,
Mhm.
in an age before we even use the term. Maybe it's the first serial killer, and yet
Right.
we don't know about it.
It's interesting because Jack the Ripper had come and gone by that time, so I don't know if America had caught on with the fascination of. But this was different from Jack the Ripper. He would write newspapers, and in fact, the one Axeman murders that people are familiar with is due to a TV show called American Horror Story. Coven season 3 was about New Orleans, and they touch on the Axeman of New Orleans. Now he was a copycat killer that came along several years after the original Axeman murders that really started, we believe, in 1911. And I think and it's amazing too, because when I tell people today from my hometown about the book and what happened, they're like, we never heard this.
Hmm.
I like unearthing mysteries that most people have never heard of and kind of bring it to light. I think one of the reasons it fell by the wayside was because it is a bit of African American history, and which is, I mean, lost over time, lost to the headlines of the Titanic. Once the Titanic sinking occurred, everybody fixated on that. So I think it just got lost in the shuffle of time. And I think my book is the first like comprehensive full book. Some stories mention it and touch on it, but this is my book is the first to focus completely on these murders. And it was a strange time, and it was a strange series of events that instilled so much fear. And when I say 54 people lost their lives, some people were just victims of circumstance. For example, as the killings continued into Smithville, Texas, communities were heightened and on alert, and someone got shot accidentally for being out at night. And people were so fearful of the Axeman, someone accidentally was killed as a result. But I count that as a casualty
Sure.
of the Axeman. Yeah.
Yeah. And the phrase "human five"
Yeah.
scrawled on a bloodstained door in Lake Charles in 1912.
Yeah.
It sounds like something out of a horror novel. Who or what was the human five? And what did that cryptic signature really mean? Do we know?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I can think of the human five senses, the five senses that human beings have. Were there five active members of this cult? It's very possible. The first people that were arrested, there were three: two preachers and a woman named Clementine Barnabette. The book also has a lot of graphics. So we see pictures from 1912. We see early crime scene shots. And thankfully, there was a reporter from the Boston Daily Globe who was traveling and just happened to be in New Orleans or around the state at the time, and went and did interviews and took pictures of some of these people. If there were five of them, that would make sense, because after three were arrested, these murders continued into Lake Charles. And the killer traveled by the rail. So he traveled the rail, traveled by train, did not bring an axe with him because the same crime scene played out everywhere. The axe was always left behind as the murder weapon, and the axe was always the family axe that belonged to the family. So back then, no central air and heating. You had to have a wood burning stove or a fireplace. So a wood pile out back with an axe, especially during the months of November and December and January, they would have had their axe just probably out and about in the yard and a tree stump, things like that. So the murderer would show up and use the family's own axe against them. The human five, it is eerie, it is creepy, and there's never been any evidence that surfaced regarding this. So I mean, it's still a great mystery to read and to obsess over like I did. But it was one of the most horrific things that I had ever written, and it kept me awake at night because I had to write about dead children. I mean, these are families being brained to death with an axe in their sleep, and infants as well.
Oh, dear Lord.
One of the craziest things is that we see post after a crime has been committed in one town, the killer or killers positioned the bodies, posed them in the sense that they had the mother and the father on their knees at the bedside, and rigor mortis had obviously set in. So they adjusted the mother and the father in a praying position with their hands clasped together, and the three children were tucked in the bed. And it appeared after the murder that the parents were praying over the dead children. And this is something straight out of like Hannibal Lecter's playbook. I mean, this is something unheard of at the time and so shocking. And sometimes I think when people say, the good old days, that's a myth. There was no such thing as the good old days. Now, it's possible that we know the killer was traveling the rails.
Why do we know that, incidentally? Sorry, why do we know that? Why did you discover that?
The close proximity. I mean, I have no proof, no ticket stubs or anything like that, but the close proximity of the homes to the rails. In other words, if you go to the site in Lake Charles, there's a rail that backs up, it curves and winds slowly around the house where it used to stand, and it's creepy. It's almost like that's the footprints of the killer. So the sheriffs out of Lafayette Parish back then, they were the ones to first deduce that the killer was traveling by rail because of the close proximity of the murders and the victims closer to the train stations and the railroad tracks themselves. I went to every crime scene that I could find, and it is a stone's throw away from an old railroad track. And the railroad tracks have been there, almost going on 200 years now. So they haven't moved. And that was one thing. And I go further into my theory that connects the Lake Charles, the Louisiana and Texas murders to another axe murder that happened in Villisca, Iowa. And I kind of theorized that this was like a snowbird who was traveling the rail, and during the winter months would be in the south, and during the hot summer months would be further up north. Now, that might be a stretch, but there's not a lot to go on. And unlike a JFK book, there's really no other experts on this over 100-year-old crime. So,
and the murders in Iowa, same MO, same victim profile, families, black families.
It's indeterminate, really. I couldn't determine whether the wife of the family or the children might have been of mixed race. It's possible, but I did not know about the Villisca axe murderers until I started doing my research further into my own book. And when I discovered it, and when I read the crime scene, it was the same exact MO. And as far as like the crime scene though, this was the guy. I mean, the first thing I said was when I read the Villisca axe murders crime scene, I said this is the same guy. This was the same guy, and without a doubt, same thing. Axe left behind, family murdered in the middle of the night in their beds, um, and there was a suspect, and he actually confessed. Now it gets real creepy because this is a reverend. His name was Reverend Kelly. He is the guy that I think did it. He's from England. He's traveling the United States. He might have grown up reading about Jack the Ripper or being fascinated with Jack the Ripper, but he was staying on the property of the family in Villisca at the time, and he said that he woke up in the middle of the night, and he claimed to have seen a dark image on the front lawn of the family's home, and he was staying there as a guest. And of course, a preacher back then would have been welcomed into so many homes back then,
Right.
traveling by rail. And he's British; he's probably somewhat charming or whatever, exotic. And so these families let him in, and he said that he heard a voice distinctly tell him, "Slay utterly." Two words that still give me chills to this day: slay utterly. And that's what he did in Villisca, and that's what he did in Louisiana and Texas.
Wow. And the biblical verse, when he
Yes.
maketh inquisition for blood, he forgetteth not the cry of the humble. Where does that, is that Old Testament, New Testament? Where does that come
That
from?
is, yeah, that is Old Testament, and it's a foreboding biblical quote from the Old Testament, to really give warning that there's a war, and it was supposed to really kind of instill fear in enemies at the time, and so yeah, and I had trouble proving that this Reverend Kelly might have been in Louisiana. I had no documented evidence to connect Villisca to the South until I discovered that there was a book that he had written. So he was a published author. He wrote something on Jesus or the New Testament, and that book was found in a library in Texas at I want to say Texas A&M or University of Texas archives. That's the closest I could get to proving that Reverend Kelly was traveling through the South. And if he would have been traveling, he would have been traveling by rail.
Right. Getting back to the woman that confessed in Louisiana, Clementine.
Yeah.
What happened to her? Was she ultimately absolved, or what happened?
It's an interesting story. So I do believe she was coerced into a confession. I mean, you have to understand, Louisiana is still kind of racist to this day. Back then, I would imagine it was probably much worse. The reason she was arrested was because she was outside of a family of six who had been slaughtered in the middle of the night in Lafayette, and she was laughing hysterically in the streets. And the sheriff had had enough of her and her family. Her dad was trouble. There was you know he was her father was implicated, her brother was implicated, and I don't know if she said what she said to protect them, but nonetheless she confessed, and she got into some detail too about her confession. Now, she did end up in Angola prison, the women's prison in Louisiana. All I know is because I had a professor reach out to me who was fascinated with this case, and he wanted to do his own research. Now, he dug a little deeper. I had a deadline, but he dug a little deeper. He took his time and came down to Louisiana and went through state records. He found out that Clementine Barnabette eventually was released from prison. Um, and that is it. She fades into obscurity. Supposedly, she had some children, but there was talk of mutilation while she was in prison. It would have been a very particular female mutilation at the time for being in prison. Maybe it was to deter her sexual proclivity or whatever it was at the time. But she was damaged goods after all that. Never received an official pardon. Just was somehow released from prison and went back, we believe, to her home in St. Martinville, Louisiana.
Didn't she belong to kind of a bizarre church, the Church of Salvation or something? And didn't she say something about, we can murder with impunity because the Bible
Yeah.
says so?
Right. Well, see, it gets into this church. It's called the Church of the Sacrifice,
Mm.
and they tied to connections in New Orleans that they say had, they incorporated a little bit of voodoo ritual into their ceremony, and there was for an instance, I theorized that. Um, there was a division among, say, the African American community where they didn't care for mixed race blacks, as it were, and that these were pure blacks, and somehow they believed that their blood, their African blood, had become sullied with the white man's blood, as it were, and so that's what they used to justify their actions in killing these mixed race families at the time. But I even heard there's some eyewitness testimonies, very little eyewitness testimony, because the crimes were so old. But there were people that I talked to that spoken to their grandmothers, and they say that Clementine Barnabette was very light skinned, which, if that were true, wouldn't really play into that theory.
Right.
Regardless, was
I think you describe her as Creole, right? So she would be able.
well, yeah, I mean, that some people did describe her as that, but mixed race, and see, in Louisiana and Creole, that Creole comes from a Spanish word, Criolla, which simply meant like a new seed planted in the New World. So I am actually descendant of French Creole in Louisiana. So basically, if you were a Creole, the original term for Creole just meant, it had nothing to do with race. It meant that your parents were born like in Europe or from Africa, and you were the first generation born in America. That made you a Creole. Later, it became equated with race and things like that. I mean, without a doubt, her ancestors came from Africa, much like mine came from France. So calling her Creole wasn't necessarily wrong, but I could never prove or verify that she was of mixed race. The one interesting thing was there is an element of voodoo, and as the killer was traveling the rails, there would be, just these uh, caravans of hoodoo not say witch doctors, voodoo medicine men, things like, there was people who practice hoodoo, which was basically a form of spiritual materialism, whereas folks say white folks would be more into hoodoo because it wouldn't go against their Catholic faith. But if they wanted to purchase a gree bag or a charm to wear around their neck, or a love potion or spell, that was hoodoo. Voodoo was a West African religion that had gods and goddesses, and they had ritual and things like that. So as the Axeman murders are occurring from town to town, it's like everybody knew that the killer was traveling the rails, and they knew what town was next. So you see this exodus of people traveling from town to town, selling lightning rods, voodoo charms, spells, things to, and the lightning rods were used to protect, of course, from the Axeman, things like that. So it was a very strange time, and as these voodoo and hoodoo, salesmen were traveling from town to town, the communities were getting heightened. It was all a lot. There was a lot of fear, and then you have some people that are kind of preying upon the fear and traveling from town to town. Almost, you think, like with the Axeman, but that's what he brought besides fear and murder to these communities.
And how were these hoodoo salesmen, if I can use that term,
Yeah.
how were they able to know which town would be targeted next by the Axeman?
Well, they didn't really know. I guess they were just assuming, because the murders started, traveling west and into Texas. So they were just going to the major cities at the time where they knew. I mean, the fear had spread all across the state of Louisiana. So it was something everybody was talking about, and they wanted protection because, I mean, no one believed that the police were providing the protection for these families, as it kept happening over and over again. So, that it was just kind of I don't know, their salesman intuition, I guess they had.
Right. And Reverend Kelly, or Pastor Kelly, he was an
Yeah.
itinerant preacher. In other words, did he have his own congregation?
He did not.
No.
Again, he was from England, and was, who knows why exactly he left England, and that may be something. But I couldn't find any records on that. I did find out that he was a Freemason, that he was actually initiated into Freemasonry in Oklahoma as the killings were occurring. And there is an interesting theory that comes out of Oklahoma. It ties to the railroad tracks. So there was a theory, and I mentioned this in my book, that this was set in place. These murders were they came about because the rail companies were seeking to scare people out of neighborhoods where the rails were running through, and they were seeking. It was a land grab
Yeah.
attempt. Was essentially what they were thinking.
That's a common denominator in a lot of American history and the settling of the West and so forth.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, what is the implication here? Are we saying that perhaps the railroad hired this guy to scare the hell out of people?
It's possible. And if so, you know, maybe his Masonic Brotherhood would be a part of that. But, here's the thing. We have Reverend Kelly standing trial for the Villisca Axe murders, and he confesses. He confesses to the murders, yet he walks. He gets off scot-free. Back then, if he were, as I know he was, Freemason, he was allowed to walk free. And it's to me, it's so shocking, the injustice that played out. And I think there is that link. Now, what's interesting is people in Villisca, Iowa, had no idea what was happening down here until I reached out to some authors and historians up in Villisca. They knew nothing about the Axeman in Louisiana and Texas. It was almost like one of America's biggest, dirtiest secrets.
Wow. So you're saying it's possible that he was protected. I mean, obviously that was kind of you're in. If you were a member of the Masonic lodge, that got you into the police force. That maybe got you onto the bench as well.
Yeah.
So they all colluded in order to protect one of their own, perhaps.
It's possible, and not disparaging Freemasons at all, because I myself am one. But there's a hand gesture, there's a symbol that this man could have flashed before the judge, and that was all the judge might have needed to see at the time. But regardless, I don't understand how this man escaped justice in America after confessing and was found guilty. I mean, so he's found guilty, he confessed, and then he walks, and he kind of fades into obscurity. Right.
We don't know what happened to him after. We don't know. He may have lived a long and healthy life.
Well, and he does. We know he somehow ended up in New Jersey, but I don't know if I could ever verify his death date or anything like that. But he ended up in New Jersey, and he ended up as a member of the Ku Klux Klan in New Jersey. Now, a lot of people say that this is simply just racism and the KKK at work at the time in instilling fear in these communities. But I don't know if at that time the KKK was. I don't know if they were as pronounced as they would have been later in the 1920s. And but I mean, it's possible. But the MO, the murdering of families in their sleep by axe, didn't fit. Well, the way the KKK like to take things into their own hands.
Right. And after his arrest, did the murder stop?
Yes. Well, that is interesting. Yeah, they did. But also, one thing I learned is that there were so many Axeman, not Axeman murders, but axe murders just across the country, that were happening. And I don't know if this was copycat killing and people were taking advantage of it. I don't know why the axe was the weapon of choice, but you got Lizzie Borden out there, part of American history. And we see the trail go cold after the Villisca murders. Now, that's not to suggest that nobody was killed by an axe after that, because, I mean, people could still be killed by axes today. But this was so horrendous and really struck a fear into so many communities. I don't, if this were happening today, if there were families being slaughtered in their beds, in the comfort of their own beds, night after night, week after week, I think our society would lose its mind. So, in other words, if the Axeman were around today doing the same thing, I mean, I don't know how we would handle it. I mean, I think there's more security now with cameras and things like that, but back then they didn't have that luxury.
Right. Well, think of the hysteria around, the Charlie Manson family murders.
Oh,
I
sure,
mean,
yeah,
that changed the culture in Los Angeles overnight. I mean, people started
without a doubt.
locking their doors for the first time and so forth, and the
That's
openness
right.
and that ended the hippie era.
Yeah.
You mentioned that Pastor Kelly was joined the KKK in New Jersey. I mean, there does seem to be obviously perhaps some racial overtone here, but there's also that ritualistic. I mean, you point out there was a bucket in the Lake Charles murder, a bucket found under the children's bed, apparently to collect their blood.
Yeah.
I mean, it does sound like a ritual sacrifice. It doesn't sound
Yeah.
like it's just about race, obviously.
Right. There was definitely something at play. Just the fact that you have religious overtones or undertones, just it speaks to something more. But it played out in the media. They really now it could be the whole media's fault by sensationalizing and putting instilling the fear of like voodoo, this strange West African religion, to its readers. It did make for a good story, I will say that. But there are certain things that really just can't be explained. Like, for example, in some of the victims, they found that, and there's evidence of this in the book, photos that the newspaper illustrations would denote. A timeline and a trail of the murders, but also strangely enough, the human five kind of comes back into play because some of the victims were found with pieces of wood stuck between their fingers to spread them using these chips of wood or pieces of wood in between like each knuckle or around, just spread. It was used. They used wood to spread the hand to make it,
Right.
the five. They had to make the five. So yeah, that strange element there is there. The human five. The only time the killer ever left a message was at the Lake Charles, uh, with the Bible quote, the Lake Charles crime scene, and human five. And then they couldn't explain. And the newspapers back then didn't want to go into so much gory detail, but that is one thing that was strangely a part of these crimes: the spreading of the hands and the symbol of the human five.
Some witnesses also claim the Axeman's followers used snakes and blood and rum in bizarre religious ceremonies. Is there credible evidence for that? I
if
mean,
they if they were practicing voodoo, which would be, see, New Orleans voodoo was different. It stems from West African religion, but you have to understand, once voodoo was brought from West Africa to Haiti, that's where, the first places in America where voodoo was probably practiced was New Orleans. There's a street called Camp Street in New Orleans, and it was originally called by the Spanish El Campo de Negro, which means the camp of the blacks. And so what they had was a lot of Haitian refugees after one of the Haitian revolutions in about the time of the French Revolution itself, the 1790s, 1780s. So Haitian immigrants start bringing with them that voodoo mixed with a little bit of hoodoo. Haitian voodoo is a little different from African voodoo, but there's, I mean, I do believe that there's something you could categorize as New Orleans voodoo, which is a mixture of Catholicism, the hoodoo and the voodoo aspects of it all, and so there's that. Now, did that actually occur at some of these crime scenes? Well, uh, Clementine Barnabette confessed to that. There was a man who was a hoodoo, um, conjurer or whatever, and he was questioned, but he was never arrested or brought in. But yeah, they were very suspicious of people who did practice these strange religions with strange gods. And I mean, look, even growing up when I was a kid, I mean, it's still part of Louisiana culture. It's still part of New Orleans culture. And I worked as a tour guide in the French Quarter for years. So the connections to Marie Laveau, I'll put it to you this way: if you work in the French Quarter, you become very superstitious. And growing up in Louisiana, that's kind of a part of everyday life. I remember growing up, we had a housekeeper, and my brother would wet the bed, and she offered a remedy, which was us starting a bonfire and using a brick and heating up this brick to get it so hot, and then make him urinate on it, and that would take away his bedwetting. So that's just like
Wow.
the way we grow up in Louisiana, and it's very strange, and we kind of just accept that, you know.
Right.
I think the media might have got a little sensationalized with it, but I mean, who's to say?
But what
There's
would
very little evidence.
what would an itinerant preacher from England know about all this, and then and incorporate some of these rituals into these
Yeah.
grisly crimes?
Well, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, like at the time that these axe murders were occurring, you have Aleister Crowley working and practicing the occult in England. I mean, it was huge. It was trendy at the time. I mean, who knows what Reverend Kelly was all into? But it's it's a strange time in American history where you think, gosh, even Aleister Crowley came to New Orleans and lived in New Orleans for a while. It was his favorite
Oh,
American city.
I didn't
Yeah.
know that. I didn't know
Oh
that.
yeah.
In your foreword, Peter Levenda writes that
Mm.
America is built on a vast burial mound, that our land is haunted by ancient violence. Do you think these murders were part of that deeper psychic haunting of the American landscape?
Uh sure. Why not? I mean, I'll just say like it's I mean, I don't discredit anything. I mean, look, American influence in the world is pretty profound. The fact that we had at one, blues generate out of that area where these strange murders are occurring. We have in the background, we have a belief in, the 1920s that Robert Johnson could go down to the crossroads and sell his soul to the devil to learn how to play blues music. And blues came out of, African and Native American or Indian influences. So that eventually became rock and roll. The culture of America is so unique. I wouldn't put it past anything. It's just, yeah, it was the wild frontier, and we're still seeing. And if you look back in 1911 and 1912, it's still the wild frontier with the Axeman riding the rails.
Right. Getting back to that biblical passage that was inscribed on the wall, it's almost as if the killer was seeing himself as God's executioner. I mean, some kind of a perverse theology.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that still goes on. I think Manson touched on that a little bit with his followers. You know, the cult like elements and behaviors that you see in this, very possible back then. There was also, eugenics out at the time, becoming very popular in the United States. And this was basically a theory that was saying, hey, there are inferior races and inferior people. And, eugenics plays into it. I mentioned it in the book. But at the time, we're also seeing these weird sort of unpublished books of the Bible that are being passed out as pamphlets with ancient symbols on how to conjure angels and demons and things like that. And a lot of people believed this stuff, and belief is a very powerful thing, no matter how you want to look at it. So I think it's possible, yeah, this person definitely saw themselves as an instrument of God's swift justice.
So, again, you've retraced these crimes. A century later, you stood where those houses once stood, followed those tracks. Did you ever feel that the darkness of this story was following you back?
Yeah, I had some sleepless nights. I will say that. And this book was one of the most horrific things I had ever written at the time. Now, I try to rival that in my fiction, but I don't think I did. And this is the kind of story that it's so true that it's horrible. Um, I will say that there were some strange moments where I was interviewing. Yeah. Look, I'll tell you this. I think the evil that was the Axeman manifested in these neighborhoods. And if you still go out to these neighborhoods today, they're terrible. They're just it's you know it's ramshackle, and the whole neighborhood is just, it looks cursed. It does. So where these murders happen, you're seeing stuff that's blighted. It's a blighted community. And I went out there trying to interview people to know if they might know anything about the murders. I only really found one person. I found this one guy that was interesting. I asked him about Reverend King, because the church was supposedly in Lake Charles, and if the church might have become another church, and it might still be standing today. I just have never found any documented evidence of that. But he told me that there was a Reverend King or a preacher that used to walk around the neighborhood with a donkey, and he was in full like preacher gear and things like that. And I thought that was strange. But there was one old lady that I found, Mrs. Jackson, and God bless her. She's no longer with us, but she was the oldest. Everybody in the neighborhood knew that she was the oldest woman in the neighborhood. So they sent me over to her house, and God, she must have been 93 at the time. And this was probably in 2012, somewhere around there. And when I went to interview her, she remembers as a kid being told by her parents that if she didn't go to bed, if her and her brothers did not go to sleep, the Axeman was going to come get them. And so the Axeman was also used as a motivation to keep your kids in bed at night. But it's interesting that even, say, 20 years after the murders, the parents never forgot that. They grew up with it, and they were passing it on, this fear, this, or unless this evil was insisting upon itself, it was still out there, in their I guess, popular culture of the neighborhood at the time. So she remembers it, and she swears, she was like, that her parents told her that the Axeman was real.
Wow. Such a gruesome and little known chapter of American history, and you're to be commended for bringing this to light. Axes of Evil, the true story of the Axeman murders. Todd, how do we get a copy?
You could order through Trine Day, which is the publishing house, and you can call an 800 number, and I actually have it right here. So 1-800-556-2012. But just check out trineday.com. And currently I am, I'm working on this story fascinates so many people, and people get just wrapped up in it. And I've got I got a producer in California and a director who are very interested in turning this into a screenplay, and they want to make an episodic streaming series. We're looking at maybe doing 8 episodes, but I'm currently writing a screenplay for a mini series, possibly on Amazon. Trying to get it's something that will probably come to fruition in about 2 years, because eventually all the true crime stuff that we have in this country, we're going to run out of material. Someday they're going to get to
I hope so. I hope so. I hope we run out of material and the carnage stops.
Right, exactly. But yeah, the Axeman takes on a whole different, it would have to be like a period piece, but the horror in the terror is timeless. Mm-hmm.
Indeed. Axes of Evil, the true story of the Axeman. Todd, great meeting you. Thank you so much for this.
Hey, thanks for having me.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.